Okay, I think it's time to begin. I am Jay Gitlin, the coordinator of Canadian Studies at the Macmillan Center of Yale. And I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. Yale University acknowledges that indigenous peoples and nations, including the Mohegan, the Mashantucket Pequot, the Eastern Pequot, the Shaktakoke, the Golden Hill Pagusset, the Niantic, the Quinnipiac, and other Algonquian-speaking peoples, have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations in this land, and continues, by the way, to exist. We have a very large Native community here at Yale. As we also have a large Canadian community. Yale has a long, I'll just say a few words quickly. Yale has a long history of connections to Canada. Our first famous Canadian alum was William Smith, class of 1745, who was the first Chief Justice of Canada, which was in 1786. Being a history, I know you want the date, so I'll say it. He was also a member of Governor Carleton's Executive Council. A more recent alum is my classmate, Bob McKeon, class of 71 at Yale, who became a professional football player with the Ottawa Rough Riders and won the Grey Cup. He later became a journalist, hosted the CBC program, The Fifth Estate, and produced several documentaries. We also have a building on campus named for a Canadian, SSS, you all know it. It stands for Sheffield, Stirling, and Strathcona. Strathcona was the Lord or Baron Strathcona, whose name was Donald Smith. He was the CEO of the Hudson's Bay Company and the main force behind the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway. He gave money to Yale, and they named part of a building for him. Now, it was one of my professors, Robin Winks, who convinced Canada to give Yale a bicentennial gift, which pays, by the way, they gave Yale a bicentennial gift, not the country, us. And that pays for a visiting professor of Canadian Studies every year, the bicentennial visiting professor. Where is Dawn? There she is. And Dawn Baisley is this year's visiting Canadian professor. Yay. So we are extremely proud to be one of the American universities with the strongest relationship to the great and sovereign nation of Canada. We do, yes, I said that on purpose. We do indeed stand on guard for thee. And now I would like to introduce my friend and colleague, Brendan Shanahan, who will introduce our guest speaker. Brendan A. Shanahan is a lecturer in the Yale Department of History and an associate research scholar in Canadian Studies at the Yale Macmillan Center. He teaches courses on North American immigration and citizenship policy, history and comparative U.S. and Canadian political history. His first book, Disparate Regimes, Nativist Politics, Alienage Law and Citizenship Rights in the United States, 1865 to 1965, has just come out, published by the Oxford University Press. His work has also appeared in the Catholic Historical Review, the Law and History Review, the American Review of Canadian Studies, and the Washington Post, among other publications. And he recently served as editor of the second volume of the Yale Journal of Canadian Studies, which has just come out about, a month ago, I guess. And if you don't have a copy and would like a copy, come and see us. We have copies for you. So with that, I will turn this over to Brendan.
Thank you so much, Jay, and thank you all for being here. For hockey fans who might be in the audience, I apologize for any false advertisement. I am not that Brendan Shanahan of the Toronto Maple Leafs organization, though it is my distinct pleasure to welcome another Torontonian today as our speaker and interlocutor for today's Q&A. Brief note, as administrator responsible for this event, Yale has asked me to remind everyone that we are committed to free expression and peaceful dissent. However, interfering with a speaker's ability to speak or the audience's ability to hear and see that is not consistent with the university's free expression policy. With that out of the way, quick stage setting for today's event. Relations between the United States and Canada, longstanding neighbors, friends, and allies, stand at a crossroads. The clock continues to tick down on President Trump's 30-day pause on the imposition of severe tariffs on Canadian goods and the Canadian government's halting of equally strong retaliatory tariffs. But the possibility of a North American trade war, among other stresses to the U.S.-Canada relationship, loom large. And if recent booings of our country's respective national anthems at recent hockey games that shattered viewing records are any indication, these stresses have been felt beyond the realms of high diplomacy and international trade. Meanwhile, domestic politics within both countries are no less tumultuous. Various forms of surging conservative populism, emphasis on varied, appear to be on the ascent in Canada as well as the United States. Federal and provincial Tory parties currently hold the upper hand in ongoing or forthcoming elections, both in Canada's largest province, in Ontario, in a couple of days, and at the national level as well. Pardon me. Meanwhile, the recent resignation of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has thrust the governing Liberal Party into a shortened leadership race to find his replacement ahead of the 2025 Canadian federal election. Debates over the best trade, macroeconomic, and diplomatic responses to the second Trump administration have sometimes proven just as fractious within party and ideological ranks as they have across partisan lines in Canada. We at the Canadian Studies program here at the Macmillan Centre couldn't have thought of a better person to come talk to and take some questions about these and other subjects than the Honourable Bill Morneau, whom we are thrilled to welcome back to Yale. He served as Canada's 39th Minister of Finance from 2015 to 2020, and was also a governor at the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Between 1990 and 2015, Mr. Morneau led the multinational human resources firm Morneau-Sheppel, now TELUS Health. He currently serves as chair of NovaSource Power Services, director at the CIBC, and at Clairvest Group Incorporated. Chair of the advisory board of Magnet at Toronto Metropolitan University, member of the Wilson Center's Canada Institute Advisory Board, and with his wife, Nancy McCain, is co-chair of the National Arts Center, the Next Act campaign. He is a distinguished fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto, and an executive in residence at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. In 2023, he released his book, Where To From Here, outlining his views on how Canadian economic policy can increase prosperity. In 2021, he was senior fellow here at the Jackson Institute at Yale. Mr. Morneau funded a school for Somali and Sudanese girls in a UN refugee camp in northern Kenya, and is currently sponsoring a scholarship program for young women refugees at the University of Toronto. He is past chair of St. Michael's Hospital, Covenant House, and the C.D. Howe Institute. He holds numerous degrees, including from the London School of Economics, and INSEAD, and Western University. Please join me in welcoming the Honourable Bill Morneau.
That was a really long resume, thank you. It's great to be here. I was last here in 2021 as a senior fellow at the Jackson Institute, and I can tell you I'm really happy I didn't have to take a COVID test before I came in today, because every time that year I had to take a COVID test before going into class. As Brandon just mentioned, it's a particularly auspicious time in Canada-US relations to be talking to you. It's disappointing when we see things like Canadians booing the US national anthem and Americans booing the Canadian national anthem at hockey games. And of course, you know, it's really, really disappointing when you consider the long and very successful relationship of Canada and the United States. I mean, the longest undefended border, familial, commercial, and cultural relationships that have gone back for generations. So I'm here hopefully today to give you a message that we can get better on a better track. That's certainly my goal, and obviously Canadians' goal more broadly in dealing with the United States. So I thought before we had a question and answer that I should give a little bit of a frame from my perspective of my time in office and the backdrops to the current challenges we're experiencing between Canada and the United States. I went into public life in 2015, as Brendan said, from a private sector role, directly into being a finance minister. And I've got to tell you that when you go into those roles immediately, you have to learn pretty fast. And what I quickly came to realize was that the leaders, the global leaders, when you go to global meetings, whether it's at the G7 or the G20 or at Davos, people generally believed pretty much the same thing as I came into public life. And I would identify 4 key ways that people thought that really told you a bit about what the world was like. People had the view, broadly among Western-based leaders, that democracy continued to be in the ascendancy. If you think back to 2015, we were in a world where we were still coming off the fact that the Soviet Union had broken down, so we felt like democracy was clearly in the ascendancy. There was a sense that market-based capitalism was working, that it had, as of 1995, when the World Trade Organization started and the 2001 entry of China into the World Trade Organization, that we'd seen huge success through market-based capitalism. We'd taken hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So basically, Western leaders thought it was working. Globalization, the idea was that this was largely a force for good and basically irreversible based on the success of supply chains for firms and individuals. And there was a sense that technology was largely a force for good, even a force for emancipation of women, if you think about it over a course of generations. So that was the world I came into in 2015, and that was the starting point for the first Trudeau administration in 2015. So we started out with a very progressive agenda, with that as our backdrop. And if I think about some of the things that were our key initiatives, you'll understand that we were trying to make our country better in that context. First and foremost, we thought that we needed to deal with a real concern over whether rewards and opportunities were going broadly to the population. So 2 of the most important initiatives that we moved forward with were, I think, probably the most important legacies of the Trudeau government. First, we put in place what we called the Canada Child Benefit, and that basically crunched together other benefits so that we could give much more money to lower and lower middle income Canadians, and significantly changed child poverty. So by taking that approach, we reduced child poverty in Canada by about 435,000 children, which in our country meant that we lowered the number of people living in poverty by about 50%. So a very, very significant effort. Second, we negotiated with the provinces to increase the Canada Pension Plan, and we did it in a fully funded way, which over the course of coming generations will mean that Canadians in retirement will be much less likely to live in poverty. So really important efforts against that first idea of thinking about how rewards and opportunities were going to Canadians. Secondly, we knew that we had to focus on prosperity. So we tried to focus some spending on critical sectors of the economy where we could actually improve Canadians' opportunity to be successful. At the same time, we made some decisions around institutions. We did things like the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which was intended to increase infrastructure investment, making structural changes to the economy and hopefully having long-term benefits. Our efforts around prosperity were not as successful as I might have hoped because of focus and implementation challenges, but they were certainly important for us at the outset. We had a real focus on Indigenous issues. We recognized that 5% of Canadians were Indigenous, the fastest growing population in our country, so reconciliation was critically important. We knew that immigration was really important to our country. We had had a successful multi-generation approach to immigration, so we put in place immigration approaches that said that we were going to increase immigration to more than 1% of the population on an annual basis. And the idea behind that, of course, is that we would be dealing with our economy by growing the economy and also our aging demographics. And of course, we did some other things that were particularly important. Most importantly, from my perspective at that time, was we decided we were going to put a price on carbon. We knew that the carbon emissions that we were generating were not priced, Not dealing with that was, in our estimation, irresponsible. So we put a price on carbon that would raise over time so that we could actually deal with our carbon emissions and our climate footprint globally. So this was a bit of a frame of where we came into office, and it was really built against that idea, the world idea that I came into office and understood to be the case. But of course, as you can imagine, that worldview changed pretty rapidly. So we came into office in 2015. By not that much longer in office, we realized that a lot of that framework was breaking down. First of all, what we came to see was that this view that democracy was necessarily the only society that was going to work was increasingly being questioned and continues to be questioned around the world today based on outcomes for citizens. The idea that market-based capitalism is the only system, of course, is challenged when we see that the market isn't necessarily dealing with externalities like carbon and finding a way to actually incorporate that into a market-based approach. Globalization, really in aggregate, a force for huge success, raising hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But those distributional impacts around globalization are causing real challenges, as we know, around the world. And I would say the canary in the coal mine was in 2016 when Donald Trump was elected, showing that in Western-based industrialized countries, those distributional effects were having real challenges for many citizens. And then finally, if we think about this idea that technology is a force for good, which we all believe to be the case, it's a little harder to see today when we see that social media is fueling anger, when we see that our democracies are having real challenges because of social media, and when we ask ourselves about the risks that we are presenting to our children. So that is a new and different perspective that emerged during my time in office. And I can tell you, for me, the moment when I understood that change was happening really came in the third week of 2017. So I want to go back to that week to talk to you about what happened that week. On January 17th, 2017, I was at Davos and I had the opportunity to listen to President Xi of China talk about the fact that China was going to be the leader in protecting the rules-based international trading system. So I want you to understand how that felt when I heard that. I had just finished in 2016 as part of a team to negotiate to allow Canada to export canola to China, and they were blocking that through non-tariff barriers. So when I heard President Xi saying that they were going to be the protectors of a rules-based international system, you can imagine my skepticism. Well, later in that same week, on January 20th, 2017, I had the opportunity, like probably many of you here, to listen to Donald Trump's inauguration speech, addressing a new and more aggressive way to deal with international trade. And while I was pretty skeptical of President Xi, I remember hearing George W. Bush, who was even more skeptical of President Trump when he said, and I quote, "That was some weird shit." So this is the world that was quite different all of a sudden, and that's the world that we were facing as we thought about how we could move forward. So for Canada, that situation meant that it was much harder to get things done. The sort of global pact around dealing with climate was increasingly challenging in Canada. We weren't able to deal with putting in place carbon pricing in a way over time that could work because, frankly, what we had was a system that was quite different than the US regulatory system, which meant that for firms and for individuals, there was a real question about whether we could align with global systems. So that's one of many reasons that became more challenging to us. We had goals within our country about putting in place a way to deal with both energy and climate. And then we had a breakdown between two of our provinces that were trying to rectify how we could put a pipeline across our country to deal with moving natural resources not only north to south, but east to west. So real challenges. And I will tell you the biggest challenge, of course, that we were right at the front of the challenge between the US and China. And I can just recount to you another couple of dates. On November 12th, 2018, I had the opportunity to sign an economic and fiscal dialogue beginning with China. And then not more than about 2 weeks later, on December 1st, 2018, what happened was the US asked Canada to put in place a jail term for Meng Wanzhou, who was the daughter of the CEO of Huawei, and basically Chinese corporate royalty, so that the US could hopefully have us extradite her to the United States because of sanctions violations. So we were right on the forefront of the US-China dialogue, which of course at that time was not a very positive dialogue. So what did that mean? It meant that our efforts like the Canada, we called it the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, well, the US didn't join that. It meant that our economic and fiscal dialogue with China, well, that was dead. And it meant that we were facing a challenge even with our southern neighbor. Because right around that time is when the United States decided to put tariffs on steel and aluminum, on Canadian steel and aluminum, that is. So tariffs on their most important friend, partner, and ally. So I would just tell you that, here we are today, and those tariffs in 2018 are really an instruction manual for what we're dealing with in 2025. At that time, the rationale for the tariffs, we were told, was the trade imbalance between Canada and the United States. Of course, there was really no trade imbalance, certainly no trade imbalance at all if you considered trade in goods and services, and obviously no trade imbalance at all if you took out energy. And if you added investment, there's actually a trade advantage for the United States. But I don't want to get carried away with facts. So that was the scenario then. And then, of course, the second issue, which was a real issue, and the real issue underlying this was that it was about transshipment of Chinese steel through Canada to the United States. So the US was concerned that China was oversupplying steel to the global markets, which was taking away the potential productive capacity of the United States. So that was the backdrop in 2018. So some of those things were similar. Trump's comments about trade imbalances, and some of them were a little bit different. But now in 2025, we're seeing a different scenario in terms of the rationale for trade. And I would tell you that what I believe the issues behind it are ones that are going to be much more challenging. First, I think that the US's approach right now around tariffs has a great deal to do with revenue generation. So if we look at the United States in 2025, with a 7% deficit to GDP, it is very challenged to find a way to raise revenue to deal with that fiscal problem. Obviously, it's not very easy to reduce expenditures, notwithstanding DOGE. I mean, the reality is that almost all of the expenditures go to health and social security and defense and interest charges. So there's not enough there to reduce expenditures to deal with that deficit. And raising taxes is pretty hard when you've said publicly that you're absolutely not going to raise taxes. So enter tariffs. Tariffs, which of course are taxes, but they're not called taxes. And tariffs are a particularly regressive form of taxation that can in fact raise revenues for the United States. So that is, I think, one of those objectives that will be very difficult for us to deal with. Second, of course, is the different geopolitical situation we find ourselves in right now. If you look at what's going on with advanced manufacturing around the world, there is a very real difference as you think about geopolitics, because any evaluation of defense capabilities needs to think about advanced manufacturing. And the projection for the US share of global advanced manufacturing in 2030 is 11%. The projection for Chinese advanced manufacturing in 2030 is 45%. So if you're a planner at the Pentagon, you're doing scenarios, that doesn't look very good, and we're dealing with that challenge. So I paint out all that picture because I think that's the frame for our discussions. From my perspective, I think there is a path forward for us in the Canada-US discussion that recognizes these challenges. I think we do need, as Canadians, to think about some of the issues that are real on our side of the equation. We shouldn't be arbitrarily deciding to put in place digital sales tax on a few American companies, because that's not what a partner should do to another partner. At least you have to come to some sort of agreement to get there. And if us spending in Canada 1.37 of our GDP on defense was not up to NATO standards in a 2015 world when I was Minister of Finance, it certainly is not up to standards in 2025 with a much more fraught geopolitical environment. So there are things that Canada needs to think about in the context of the world that we live in 2025 that I think will create a path that is quite different. And then internally in Canada, we're going to need to think about things that play to our advantages. We can think about how we can improve our immigration system to continue to attract attract the best and brightest. We can think about how we can be part of a global energy solution that recognizes challenges in Asia and Europe with LNG. We can think about our capacity in the nuclear sector with small modular reactors. We can think about how we can improve our own infrastructure around energy and around our own systems. So there are things that we can do not only to work together with the United States, but to create more agency for Canada. The challenge we'll have is that we will need to keep our heads about us, have cool heads in the face of demeaning and frankly offensive dialogue, and do that in a way that recognizes the long-term positive and very beneficial relationship between our two countries. So that's some frame, and I hope that provides a frame for some of our Q&A, Brendan, as we spend more time.
Thank you so much. So I'll get us started, with a couple questions and then turn over to the audience for a general Q&A. Building on that last point, Bill, in reading through your book, I was struck by the tension.
I'm so glad somebody did.
Well, I was struck by the tension you described between, on the one hand, to put in quotes, I think in your conclusion, occasionally Canadian policymakers need to, quote, stomp our feet and speak a little louder to get American policymakers' attention. And on the other hand, just bite one's tongue from time to time between indignities and slights, and keep one side on the bigger picture. You described this in particular in how you navigated and developed a very strong working relationship with your counterpart, Secretary Mnuchin. I'm curious if you still believe that those lessons apply from the Trump 1.0 era into these early days and looking ahead towards the period of Trump 2.0.
Well, I mean, look, everybody in this room will have their own views on the similarities and the differences between Trump administration 1 and Trump administration 2. I think there are some real similarities. I think there is a continuing idea that you create disruption and noise over here so that you can get something done over here. We may not like this, and we might not like the outcomes either, but I think if you can find a way to use this to get some of the outcomes that you want, then that is what you're trying to do as an ally and a partner. From Canadians' perspective, we're going to continue to share the geography of North America. We have 3/4 of our exports going to the United States, so even in a world where we significantly increase our exports to other countries, we're still going to be very intertwined with the U.S. economy. So we need to find a way through this. So dealing with the challenges and the disruption, yes. Finding people that we can have relationships with. These are going to be critically important steps in order for us to hopefully come out in a situation that will work for both countries.
Very cool. Thanks. I've got one second question, and then we'll turn over to the audience. I'm a political historian. I see several students, past and present, in my classes, particularly from my comparative U.S. and Canada politics class. Canada-U.S. relations have always played an important role in Canadian national politics, particularly in relation to U.S. national politics. I cannot think of a modern election in Canadian political history in which U.S.-Canadian relations was not an important topic of consideration. From the acrimonious relationship between Diefenbaker and John F. Kennedy to Canadian participation or lack thereof in various U.S. Military actions. Occasionally, trade reciprocity debates, free trade even, have become the foremost question on the ballot box in a Canadian national election. Late 19th century, the Conservatives rallied around the flag in the language of protectionism. 1988 election was the free trade debate, which a different era of the Conservative Party won on the measure of free trade. I'm curious if you see either the next election lining up to be one of those free trade elections where that is question number one, or if it is more so a question of managing this relationship writ large, in which trade relations is a central but not the only element of that debate. And if that has any lessons, either drawn from longer or even more recent Canadian political history, thinking of how many voters responded positively to the re-election of your government in 2019, in part because of the high marks voters gave to the idea of managing that U.S.-Canada relationship.
That's a lot.
Yes.
Yeah. So, well, let me start with where you ended. So our 2019 election was an election that was held right after the renegotiation with the United States. And I think any fair-minded person would say that we took a difficult situation and ended up fine. Mm-hmm. So, Donald Trump said we wanted to fundamentally renegotiate NAFTA, and we fundamentally renegotiated it and ended up with the exact same deal. So a couple of years and nothing to get to a conclusion. So you would think that would mean that the government would be in a good place. Yeah. But I think I want to remind you, and I know you know this, we did not get a renewal of the majority mandate. And I think that was only partially as a relationship to what happened with Canada-US. So I think it's instructive in that regard, because I don't think people necessarily, at least not typically, they don't vote because of one single issue. And so I think what's going to happen around this time is there will be one overwhelming issue, and that is, how are we going to deal with this moment of crisis? Okay. And that has multiple aspects to it. It's how are we going to deal with Trump, but it also is, what are we going to do internally to deal with the ramifications of what will probably happen as we deal with Trump? So I think there's a broad-based expectation that there will be some tariffs, and those tariffs will have an economic impact on Canada. And as a result, we need to be more serious about our economic future, because we don't have the same advantages that we had before. What is going on, though, underneath that is a general level of anxiety post-COVID against prices. So in the last 5 years in Canada, increase in cost of gas and food is around 27%. In the last 5 years in Canada, increase in wages is around 16%. So there's an 11% gap. And so there will be most people that will be front of their mind, what are we going to deal with the United States and how are we going to respond? But many of them will also be saying, eggs are a lot more expensive than they used to be, and that's not great from my perspective. So those people that are concerned about that will have a second issue. And it may exacerbate the concern around economic outcomes. But that second part doesn't necessarily bode well for the Liberals.
Right.
So I can't handicap it, other than to say it's different than it was pre-Trump. Because before Trump, there would have been virtually no possibility of the current government being brought back. And after Trump, I would say it's still not it wouldn't be my base bet, but it's more probable.
Wonderful. Thank you. Would anyone like to lead us off with a question? Zachary, would you like to?
Thank you, and thank you so much for joining us. I was really fascinated by your discussion of Canada's role in U.S.-China relations. I'm wondering if you think there's room or political will for Canada and the United States to be partners against Chinese aggression or against the potential threat of Chinese military expansion, and what that might look like.
At least in my estimation, based on the way geopolitics is going, I don't think Canada has a huge range of possibilities in dealing with China. So increasingly in a world where there are two spheres of influence, if you're on the American side, I think you're being forced to choose. And so I think Canada's ability to have independent agency in dealing with China is quite limited. And that means for individuals and for businesses, the exchange, the commercial opportunities with China are significantly diminished. Our pension funds in Canada are taking down their positions in China. Investments are being scrutinized to a much greater degree than they were before. Political acceptance of Chinese investments into Canada has declined precipitously. So in all those ways, the relationship between the two countries has become much, much more fractured. I don't expect that we'll be able to find a way to be in between those two. I think we'll have to choose a side. And I think irrespective of which party comes out of the next election, they will have to hew to that reality. Although there is going to be a debate, because with the frustration with the United States as it stands right now, there will be those, in particular on the left, that say, shouldn't we be more open-minded to dealing with America's natural adversaries? But I don't think they'll win.
Please, and could you just introduce yourself as you ask your question?
Hi, my name is Carter Cashin. I'm a sophomore history major at Yale. I was just kind of following Zachary's question. If the U.S. is becoming a more unfaithful ally that's harder to trade with, where else can Canadians look to trade and sell their goods? Are there other markets in Europe or in East Asia that you think are opportunities for more business with Canada?
So what Canada is going to be debating over the course of the next couple of years is exactly that question. How do we diversify our trade, and where can we diversify it to? At some levels, it's really hard to do. I mean, there's obviously natural advantages to trading with a partner that is geographically proximate, that has the same language, that has very few cultural barriers. It is much harder if you're running a firm at a firm-based level to do services, which are an increasing part of our economy, to countries where the language is different, or the customs are different, or the geography is much farther away. So it is hard, but in some places the answer will be, for sure, we will find a way to diversify. So what you can expect to see is much more Canadian willingness with our natural resources to move to places that are willing to to buy them. So when we started with producing more LNG, Japan was very quickly interested in buying our LNG and getting contracts for it. There's opportunity for us to continue to diversify some of our resource base. So there will be places where we can expand trade relationships, where there's going to be equal merits for two countries. So if you think about the UK right now, which has put itself in an unfortunate corner in their trading, Canada could be a better and better partner. But I don't think we should kid ourselves. The reality is the relationships between Canada and the United States are very significant, and they're unlikely to go away. And even the imposition of tariffs. I mean, it's important to remind Canadian business people who are pulling their hair out is that we were trading with the United States when we had an 85-cent dollar. We were trading with the United States when the Canadian dollar was $1.08 to the United States dollar. And so the imposition of tariffs, while difficult and long-term structurally particularly difficult, at a 70-cent dollar or 71-cent dollar where we are now, clearly leaves lots of room for possibility. So I like to tell people, we need to do two things at once. Try and think about how we can solve our challenges with the United States while figuring out other opportunities.
Please, in the back.
Thank you very much. My name is Arun Dayanandan. I'm a third-year PhD student at the Forest School. And my question is regarding, you mentioned natural resources and diversification of markets. What does that mean for Canada's environment? Whether we're talking about plantation forests in the East Coast in Quebec or primary natural forests in BC, is this something that's going to take a back seat to a lot of these kind of market-based approaches and things that we're thinking about now that things are a different world?
I do think that the balance is likely to shift somewhat. I can't predict exactly how it will pan out over time. There are just some things about the underlying Canadian economy that make that shift difficult. If you think about where Quebec gets its electricity from, 94% of its electricity comes from renewables. In Alberta, 14% of its electricity comes from renewables. So there are natural impediments in Quebec to think about exploitation of fossil fuels. And there are natural reasons, both because of usage and because of the situation of access to fossil fuels in Alberta, where they're going to be pro. So there will continue to be barriers. We're in a moment where I think some of those barriers will break down. And so let me give you an example of one that I think will break down. We currently, the way we get oil from Western Canada to Ontario is through Line 5. It's a pipeline that goes from Alberta down through Michigan to Ontario. So that's a strategic vulnerability for Canada because the oil that gets to Ontario has to go through the United States. So it would be very reasonable for me to expect that we can get our act together in Canada to say, we've got to solve that problem. We need to have a pipeline that goes actually across the country without going into the United States. That'd be an example where I think cooler heads will say, look, we do want to be responsible. We do want to price carbon. We know we've got long-term responsibilities, but we also know that that energy transition is not happening tomorrow, and we need to deal with geopolitical realities. So some of those things will transpire in a way that's different than it would have happened without the U.S. triggering it. And to the extent that you're worried about our timber resources and whether we're all of a sudden going to exploit them more rapidly, I would be surprised if that's the case because I don't think the economic case is going to be so strong to make that happen. So I think there'll be barriers to that. But for sure, a lot of barriers will be at least reconsidered. Whether this moment will stay as fraught as it is anyone's question. I mean, the Canadians are pulling their hair out right now, but we could find ourselves in 3 months with a settled situation around tariffs that's not what we think it's going to be today. So if, for example, it's 10% tariffs across all U.S. trading partners, that's quite different than 25% tariffs against all trading partners. If it's against all goods versus against some subset of goods. So it's really hard to predict how enduring this moment will be without knowing what the end game is from the United States. And I don't even think they know what the end game is either, but we'll see.
Hi, my name's Amy Boot, and I'm a first-year Yale College student. And my question is, how has the Canadian political vision for the carbon price changed since it was implemented? And what do you see as the future for the carbon price and other Canadian climate policy in light of the second Trump administration?
So, our idea, which we thought was a really good idea, was to implement the carbon price with two separate parts to it and do it in a way that would create popular support. So one carbon price for large emitters, which was essentially to oil and gas sector, other sectors that were large emitters, and the other to consumers that would retread the funds going back to them. So the idea is that the bringing the money back to citizens would create popular support. We didn't implement that policy as well as we could have, in hindsight. The ability to move the money back to citizens was complicated. People didn't understand it, didn't really realize where it's coming from. So, hindsight is 20/20, but that is the reality. So I don't expect that any, and even the current leadership candidates, there's really only, I think, one of them in the Liberal Party that wouldn't rethink that. So they're all going to get rid of the consumer-facing carbon price. So like in Australia, that's probably going to be dead for at least one electoral cycle, if not permanently. So that's my expectation. The heavy emitter carbon pricing, I think that will endure. It's right now it's kind of a clumsy mechanism. There's not really an effective market for carbon credits, so there needs to be some work to be done on that. I expect that it's entirely possible that will endure, and that presents more than, I don't remember the numbers, but it presents certainly more than 50% of the advantage from carbon pricing. So, the reality is carbon pricing is the cheapest economic way to move people off the usage of carbon. But we'll have to use regulatory approaches instead, and that's not great for long-term economic health, and it makes it more expensive. It makes the transition more expensive.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Prithvi Narayanan. I'm a first-year student at Yale College. I'm wondering about considering the very strong ties and inherently intertwined relationship, economically speaking, between the United States and Canada. why haven't we had a general agreement on tariffs and trade implemented between us, like to ease economic barriers between the United States and Canada? And would there have been an opportunity to implement such an agreement during the renegotiation of NATO? And considering, NAFTA, thinking about another course. And finally, would this have alleviated concerns today with tariffs if we had a gap in place like in the present?
Well, I think the way to think about this is NAFTA is kind of a gap. So I think the way to think of the North American Free Trade Agreement, or now the USMCA, is it's effectively an agreement on tariffs and trade between countries that has significantly lowered trade barriers. Barriers still exist. So the agreement allows for continuing, for example, Canadian protection of our dairy sector. So there are exemptions to that agreement. But I think what you should think about is that the USMCA is in fact a trade agreement. And the question really is, in the absence of that, what are we going to come to? And in the absence of the U.S.'s willingness to abide by an agreement, which of course was one that was signed to go through till 2026, what's the advantage of having an agreement to start with if it's not one that can be accepted and abided by? So those are real questions. I mean, I would always come down on the side of a rules-based system is better, broadly speaking, for global participants. It's certainly better for smaller countries. And for that reason, we should be trying to abide by the rules that we come to. And in the face of these sorts of challenges, we should try to figure out a way to get to a new normal that's having as many of the advantages of the old normal as we possibly can.
My name's Dan. I'm not a student here. I'm a retiree who's interested in this subject. I sympathize with Canada's plight, trying to determine what the United States endgame is, and its acknowledgement that they probably don't know what it is as well. But you mentioned that and the difficulties in negotiating with the present administration. But I've recently seen some advertisements on TV getting at the actual economic argument about supply chains going across, particularly with Ontario and Detroit in the auto industry. But my question is, I find that very effective, but if the Trump administration is attacking it on aluminum and steel, can you just give a sort of a summary about what disputes over the last 30 years under NAFTA there has been between the U.S. and Canada on those two elements? And I mean, I gotta believe there are arbitration tribunals that try to resolve those under NAFTA if there is in fact a dispute. And to me, it's conspicuous by its absence that I just don't see that subject in the last 30 years being a big point, which tells me just ammunition for just undermining that whole thrust by the Trump administration. And what has been the history since NAFTA was enacted between the United States and Canada regarding aluminum and steel disputes?
So there have been many disputes under NAFTA, and I'm not aware of disputes prior to 2018 on steel and aluminum. So. The steel and aluminum situation is quite particular to the Donald Trump administration, the first Trump administration. And the backdrop to it was that there was, as I mentioned, a concern around transshipment of steel from China. So really this worry that there was oversupply of steel on the global market, which is going to destroy the willingness of steel companies to invest in the United States. And if that steel is being produced in China and coming through Canada and transshipped into the United States, then that means that we are part of the problem if that's the case. So in the renegotiation that happened in 2018 between Canada and the United States, we had to first prove that there was a balance between steel and aluminum between Canada and the United States, which there broadly was. So Right now, the statistics are Canada sends about $8.5 billion of steel to the United States. The United States sends about $7.5 billion of steel to Canada. We send in Canada about $11 billion of steel to the United States. The United States is not a big producer of aluminum, so $11 billion of aluminum is not, so that's not really relevant. You know, that was not the problem. The problem was, you know, making sure that it was understood at the top echelons, or maybe the very top echelons of the White House, and then making it clear that we were not transshipping. So we had to show that we were protecting from Chinese steel coming through our borders and going to the United States. So that was what went on in 2018. We solved for that problem. Of course, you know, it was a bit of an artificial problem. So now what's happening is I think it's still part of the concern around advanced manufacturing in the United States. So, you know, if you're going to do advanced manufacturing, it's not really a jobs program, right? It's jobs for robots because, you know, most advanced manufacturing is robots. But you need the stuff to fuel the machinery, which is often steel and aluminum. So that's why that's the target. So right now, that's why it's in the bullseye. I'm not up to date on Chinese production of steel, so I don't know if there's oversupply going onto the market. But it's certainly not a Canadian problem.
Mm-hmm.
My name is Mike. I'm not at liberty to disclose my department except to say that I'm part of Don's posse. Since we just
Does that mean you're a Canadian? No, okay.
In disguise.
Okay, I won't ask for your department then.
Okay. No, since we just celebrated, this is a question on culture. Since we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of Saturday Night Live and the comic genius of Lorne Michaels, do you think the Trump tariffs will be imposed on sketch comedy? And will Canada and the U.S., or will Canada continue to export comedians to the U.S. after Trump?
But you know, I know your question's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but it's really serious in a sense that, you know, the weird part about all this discussion is it's all about goods. Mm-hmm. And you know, think about where our economy is going in terms of what like in the United States, only 8% of people work in manufacturing now. So that means 92% work in something else. So we're talking about goods and not talking about services. So it's kind of a bizarre discussion in the context of a 2025 economy. And you know, as you say, I mean, we get value out of watching Ryan Reynolds and you know, Ryan Gosling and I guess the Ryans. I like to always tell people that, you know, half of their entertainment is coming from Canada. Our joke is that Bruce Springsteen, you know he's Canadian, right? Maybe not Bruce, but many others. And so it's a good question, and it points out the oddity of this discussion broadly.
Hi, my name is Insia. I'm a senior in Yale College, and I'm from Edmonton, Alberta. My question is about how Canada's government deficit in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic has reached new highs, like many other countries, not unusual in that regard. But considering that both Pierre Poilievre and I think almost all of the Liberal Party candidates are not looking, are pretty unwilling to raise taxes, and in the wake of this geopolitical struggle with our closest ally, what is Canada's economic future? How is that deficit, in your opinion, how should it be addressed? How will it be addressed?
So that's a really good question. And so it's really important to start with context here. So the Canadian deficit is about 1% of the Canadian GDP. Mm-hmm. I get it wrong. It's about 1.5% of the Canadian GDP. The US deficit is approaching 7% of US GDP. So it's just dramatically different. So the US is adding about $2 trillion of debt to its situation, or about 2% of global debt each year. So it's a very different world. So in that context, Canada does not look profligate. Now that said, we don't have a reserve currency in Canada. Our situation is different. There's a very real concern, and I think it's an appropriate concern, that we overspent during COVID And that caused some particular problems in our country. So we now have a real challenge around immigration, which was built off actually having too generous programs coming out of COVID and not being able to get people back to work, which meant we had a lot of temporary foreign workers and a lot of students that came to Canada, and that created some challenge around immigration. So the increase in the deficit caused other ancillary problems that are very real. We have to think about how we're going to increase our defense spending, which is, call it another 0.5% of GDP at least. So, if you think about that on the backs of a 1.5% deficit, that's a challenge. So all of the next governments, irrespective of what the party is, will have to deal with tightening government spending. That will be a reality, and reallocating spending from some places to other places. So that will be whether it's, I expect Mark Carney will win the Liberal leadership in a couple weeks. Whether he wins as Prime Minister or Pierre Poilievre wins as Prime Minister, either one of them will face that reality. And that means that there will be some need to increase private sector investment because public sector investment is going to go down. So if we want to continue to have investment, we need to have it come from somewhere. So policies to increase private sector investment will be critical.
Hi.
Oh, can you I'm sorry, turn it on. Yeah, there you go.
Testing? Okay. Hi, my name is Joy. I'm a third-year student at Yale College. I'm born and raised in Ottawa, Canada, and I think interestingly, I remember that the first big victory of the Liberal government in the 2015 election was also around the time when I first started, because I was 12, I think. And so that was sort of the time when I first started paying attention to politics, and now I'll be turning 22, so it's interesting to know, the only administration I've ever known is a Liberal Party administration. My question is, how should an incumbent party communicate, its tangible victories in reconciliation with voter frustration surrounding things like inflation? And do you think that there have been any failures of political communication or positioning, whether in the past or in the lead up to the next federal election?
So I think that there's been some, not coincidentally, I left in 2020, so I think all the failures were after I left. But jokes aside, I actually think that's true. And it's not related to that, but what happened, of course, is we went through COVID, and it was a really, really difficult time. And coming out of COVID, people were feeling, and continue, I think, to feel very anxious. So I think there were a couple of really important mistakes that were probably made from a policy standpoint, or maybe three. The first one I was identifying was around the amount of spending during COVID meant that during the hangover period, we found people not wanting to go back to work as quickly as they would otherwise have wanted to go back to work, which means there was a demand for more immigration, and that changed a bit of the Canadian consensus around immigration. So that's a very unfortunate outcome because immigration, I think, has been a real success story for Canada for many generations. So that was a political failure that I don't think was rectified as quickly as it could have been. Second, I think as we came out of COVID, the amount of inflation meant that you probably needed to pivot fairly quickly to think about what are the things that you can do to support Canadians with that kind of inflation. So, I wasn't there, and I'm sure people were working with their best intent, but inflation hits people that are low and middle income much harder than it hits higher income people. So some sort of supports for lower and middle income people coming out of that, probably in hindsight, we would have thought about that differently. And third, and really important for someone who's your age, 22, I think that there's real questions around intergenerational fairness that have come up over the course of the last decade, certainly while I was there, and even more so now. So the combination of low interest rates, which has been around for a long time, and changing demographics means that prices for assets have gone up significantly. And that means that for young people, they're more frustrated because the promise of Canada and the promise of the United States has been for generations, the next generation will be better off than the last. And I think it's hard for us to argue right now in many Western democracies that that promise is necessarily going to be kept. It will be hard to figure out how people in your generation can get those same level of assets as the last generation. So dealing in particular with housing over the course of the last few years is a missed opportunity. And it should have started earlier. When I was there, I was trying to do it. I wasn't nearly as effective or as focused as I should have been. But certainly after COVID, there was a really clear necessity to deal with that. So I think those are some policy either mistakes or errors of omission that are absent this Trump phenomena would have certainly led to the demise of the Liberal government. And even with the Trump phenomena, may well lead to the demise of the Trudeau government, or whoever it's going to be, the next person.
I'm going to take the moderator's privilege to jump on here because I think this question is such a key theme of your book, the question of focus on communications versus management, and particularly where and how decisions are made, whether at the cabinet table or in the PMO, which is more or less the equivalent of the White House in the American political system. Building on that point, do you think this particular government, as decision-making increasingly grew concentrated within the Prime Minister's office, is that a natural tendency of just lengthier and lengthier governments, the move away from cabinet decision-making, or is that something that you saw happening more so because of the decisions that were made unique to this particular administration?
So, and it's kind of related to, what's your name?
Yeah.
Your question, Joy, your question, because, so first of all, I think there's a secular trend towards more concentration in, probably in the United States, in the White House, in Canada, in the Prime Minister's office, and certainly communications drive that to a great extent. The speed of the communication cycle, the need to deal with eruptions here, there, and everywhere through social media means that you want to try and control at the top so that you don't have these problems that derail your agenda. One of the challenges as that happens is you get people in those offices, in the Prime Minister's office, that are really good at communications and not necessarily good at much else. So you end up not having, and that's why your question's so interesting, because you said, did we have any failures in communications? And what I'm saying is, actually we had some failures in policy. And the failures in policy means that, it's not good enough to communicate stuff, you don't have anything to communicate. So you actually have to have the policy that you can then communicate. And so what happens if you have that centralization, you have the focus on communications, you have less focus on policy as a natural outcome, and therefore sometimes miss the trick on what's most important. So that is certainly happening in our society, and it's, I think, happening in other countries too. When I spoke to my colleagues, it's not happening in undemocratic countries. The Minister of Finance in Saudi Arabia is not worrying about this as much. But the Minister of Finance in France was worrying about it a lot. Like when the Gilets jaunes happened in France with the protests in the streets, they were really very worried about the comms problems. And when I told him that our approach to pricing carbon was to retread the money to citizens, he's like, oh my God, I wish we'd done that. It would have been able to solve the problem. Of course, it didn't work in our country either. But the point is, the policy sometimes is the important issue as opposed to the comms.
Other questions?
Hello, can you hear me? Do you need to take a drink of water?
No, but I'm scared because I know you're the visiting professor from Canada.
My name is Dawn Paisley, and I'm at York University, and the last time I heard you in a room was in 2018, when you visited York to our new latest engineering building. Anyway,
How'd I do? Was it okay?
I think it was lovely. I was
At least you came back. You came back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. After you, because you were here first. Anyway, so I'm Dawn Paisley, and when I'm not sitting in the Macmillan Centre and the Political Science Department, I'm a biology professor, but I'm here because I do a lot with science, policy, politics, and communication. And I do remember when NAFTA was being debated in the 1980s, because I'm old. But anyway, I want to talk about 25 years ago, when there were congressional hearings or thereabouts in the States, when Swiss Re and all the reinsurance companies were being questioned about climate change. And the reason why I want to raise this now is that in light of what's going on with global warming, and the fact that Mother Nature always bats last, regardless of whether a tech billionaire thinks they can buy themselves out of the forthcoming apocalypse, because no, at a certain point, and there's a great movie about that, can't remember the name of it, Franny Armstrong's movie from about 15 years ago, COP15. Anyway, what we've seen now, of course, is with increasing extreme weather events like the wildfires, and a lot of people haven't got insurance because insurance companies can't afford all these payouts. My mum's house in Mississauga 2 weeks ago was hit with this ice damming business because of that huge dump of snow. So I spent a lot of time on Zoom this weekend and with the insurance company, and do we need to replace the front windows and yada, yada, yada. But those kind of, and there was an ice storm here. We didn't have a big dump, but we basically had an ice storm with lots of branches down on trees. Can you comment about whether or not, I mean, and I think the US is currently out of Paris. It's so much flip-flopping in my lifetime, in and out, of the UNFCCC. At the end of the day, there's going to be an awful lot of people in Canada and the States just without home insurance, and this is going to be an enormous destabilizing influence, whether you're paying attention to it or not. So could you just comment a little bit about the conversations when you were a finance minister or now? You've mentioned carbon pricing a lot.
Yeah.
You know, I love carbon taxes. I remember Stéphane Dion's one-time challenge. That was brilliant. Didn't last long, but anyway, could you comment a little bit about that? Because it's just going to escalate.
Well, when I was in the role, there were multiple insurance companies who came to me saying that they thought we needed to deal with this, and they were their issues were wide-ranging, not only climate but even earthquake protection in Western Canada, where there's very significant building on earthquake areas. So yeah, it's going to be it will continue to be a big issue. It'll get bigger. There will be real questions around government policy in terms of whether insurance companies need to be forced to, if you're going to cover one area, you need to cover broader areas like what's going on in California and Florida right now. So I expect that there will be, there'll be popular uprising if people can't get insurance in certain areas. That'll happen, and then there will be very real questions about whether the government policies will start to force people to relocate because it's not sustainable where they are. So I expect to happen.
In the short term? Because we're in that future now. I mean, we've known about this for 20 years, 30 years actually.
I guess the question is what the short term is. I don't know. I mean, we keep punting it. The challenge with climate change is the costs to do the transition aren't getting smaller. They're just getting put in fewer years. So they get more and more expensive. So the real risk is that what do I worry about most? I worry about the confluence of a bunch of things coming together. So we have $100 trillion of global debt right now against $110 trillion global economy. So that's not really a good place to be when China's holding a significant amount of the debt and we don't know where they're holding it. So I worry about that happening. And if that happens at the same time as climate disasters without insurance coverage, that countries need to all of a sudden spend money over there, so their debt goes up at the same time as, so I worry about the confluence of all these things causing abrupt change as opposed to, appropriate policy-based change. Unfortunately, I think that's the more likely outcome for some of these things, because I think we're not reacting to the reality of our world in a way that we should. So crises will be the thing that will trigger it. And in the case of debt, that's kind of what I expect, because in dealing with debt, you've got the option of inflation, allow inflation to go faster. You've got the option of reducing expenditures, which nobody seems to want to do, or increasing taxes, which is not really a likely outcome. So your fourth option is wait for a crisis. And it kind of looks like that's what's happening in debt, and that's what's happening in climate. And the challenge with crises is mainly poor people get hurt, as we saw in 2008. So that's not a very optimistic way to think about the world, but that's the frame that I have.
Thank you for a really wonderful talk. I'm Rob. I'm not a student here, but my daughter is a student here, so I'm just visiting actually. But I grew up in St. Clair Young. I went to a Catholic school that wasn't Senator O'Connor, and I'm with the faculty at Western right now, actually. So
You went to a high school that was what?
I went to a Catholic high school that was not Senator
Oh, that was
O'Connor.
not Senator O'Connor,
Yeah.
where I went. Okay,
Yeah,
there you go.
same house, actually. So
Okay, there you go. That's where my dad went.
Was a very good man.
Yeah.
Anyway, you know, if you were the finance, two questions actually. One, if you were the finance minister now, how would you handle these threats about the tariffs? And I think Trump this afternoon said they were going to happen no matter what. And secondly, despite the things that happened when you were the finance minister, have you ever thought about re-entering politics?
So on the first one, what would I do? I would take a page out of the Mexican president's playbook, and I would try my best, do as much as I could behind the scenes as opposed to in front of the scenes. I would not be doing what Prime Minister Trudeau is doing and sending out tweets that are tit-for-tat tweets to President Trump, because I just don't see how that's in any way helpful in this kind of situation. So I would be trying my best to do things behind the scenes. I would be working to do the things that are in Canada's best interests, but in the mutual best interest of both countries, and do it quickly. So clearly we've said we'll shore up the border, which is not really a problem because there's not really a border issue, but we should do it because there might be a problem, because if Trump starts deporting a huge number of people, a lot of them might want to go north, and that would be disruptive. So you do that anyway. I would be saying that we're going to move forward on our defense spending much more rapidly, and I would be realistic and say, if we're going to do more defense spending, we're going to have to buy the kit from the United States, because that's where the stuff's produced. So I would, on purpose, say that's where a lot of the spending is going to go, because it's going to go there anyway, so you might as well be open and honest about it. I would get rid of irritants. I would say, we're getting rid of the digital sales tax. We're arbitrarily getting rid of the thing that we arbitrarily put in, and we're doing it without asking for any concession from you. So I would start down those paths. And then I would be trying my best to work with other countries to say that this change in the global trading system is not going to be advantageous. But I expect that there's some actual meat behind the Trump decisions around tariffs, as I identified. I think there are some real issues that they're trying to solve for. And my hope is that they will do it in such a way that they're not as high for close partners, which I don't think they should be, and that they eliminate certain sectors of the economy. It makes no sense on energy, for example. And other sectors like automotive, which would include steel, that they jeopardize both Canada and the US because the trade is so interrelated. So you try and go after specific exemptions there. And then put all that aside, which is dealing with the US, I'd focus on our own problems. I would make sure that our country is as well run as it can be. I would bias ourselves to growth in all of our economic decisions. I would get rid of interprovincial trade barriers as best I could and set us on a long-term barrier to making sure that's the case. I would make sure our immigration system brought the best and the brightest to the country, and on and on and on. There's a whole host of things that you can do. So that would be the agenda if I were there. And to your second question, I'm not going to be there because I'm not running. And politics is all about timing. So the opportunity for a Liberal, in my estimation, 6 months ago was not very great. The world has changed in such a way that maybe it is a little greater than it was then. But you don't jump into a nasty job with all the negatives if you think that the outcome is probably that you're not going to win anyway, and that was my equation.
So I'm Skip Worden. I'm a research scholar at Harvard and a Yale alum, so I actually went to school here, so it's familiar. The one thing in your talk that really struck me was the 47%, I think 47 in terms of China share of manufacturing.
The UN estimates are 45% of advanced manufacturing globally by 2030 will be Chinese.
So in stating that, I was wondering you stating that, I was wondering whether you're thinking that Trump's attempt to use tariffs to reinvigorate American manufacturing won't succeed, that long-term trend will continue. The other thing, it's interesting to me that you're talking about the carbon taxing and immigration. And I'm thinking long-term in terms of climate change and global warming and the effect of that in terms of places like Greenland and Canada as the agriculture shifts north, and Canada might benefit by that. So it's interesting that you're doing that. I wonder if Canada's thinking long-term in terms of the effects of climate change and the positives that it might have for Canada. So those are sort of my two separate
So I think those are really interesting questions. So on the 45% of advanced manufacturing being Chinese by 2030 and the 11% of American, I think it's really clear that there are people around Trump, maybe he's not thinking that, but there are people around him who are very worried about that dynamic. And I think the argument that tariffs create more investment in the United States is unequivocally true. If you create a barrier, I mean, there will be companies that in Canada, right now there are companies, I know them, that are thinking about whether they should make their next plant investment in Toronto or Toledo, and they're saying, well, if my market is in the United States, I better make it in Toledo. So it will have the impact of moving investment into the United States. It is a zero-sum game in that sense. So that it is true. To your second part of your question, though, around can you really deal with this trend? I mean, it does sometimes feel like the little Dutch boy, you know, with your finger in the dam, because it is really hard to change these dynamics because they're about, you know, global economic realities and the cost of things in different countries and the cost of labor in different places. So it is hard to make that change happen. But that is the change that I think some people are trying to engineer. The Canadian objective should be to try to be in that tent. So we should be saying, you know, we are partners. We are historic allies, partners, and friends, that to the extent that the advanced manufacturing is necessary, it is just as good in Toronto as it is in Toledo. Because if it's in Toronto, we're still not going to deal with Huawei and have the stuff in our stuff in Canada. So we are separating our spheres of communication. So I think that for sure is the argument. To the second issue around you know, whether climate change helps Canada or Greenland, you know, of course people say this stuff. I don't think climate change really helps anyone. I mean, of course, our agricultural sector will, you know, have changes because of climate that could potentially be advantageous, but there'll be a whole lot of other negatives. You know, the negative around, you know, where people live and how people live. And so I wouldn't want to go to that balance of equation, say, like, we're the lucky ones because it's going to be good news for us, when there's people in Fort McMurray in Alberta that are like losing their homes because of wildfires. So I just don't think that's an equation that's reasonable. What Canadians, I think, recognize is that, you know, we got great good fortune that we have a country that has lots of natural resources, and we have a big carbon footprint. So how do we responsibly deal with those resources and hopefully minimize our carbon footprint over time? And there's a real question, and I think it's an appropriate question. Is the approach to reduce our, you know, withdrawal or taking out, you know, our natural resources, or should we take the Norwegian approach and say, look, the world is continuing to use this stuff. We got to try and find a way to reduce emissions over time, but you know, we'd rather our oil and gas be there instead of the oil and gas from Saudi Arabia and Qatar. So you know, that's a competing point of view. I don't even need to tell you where I am on it, but you've probably guessed by now. But I think that there's opportunities for Canada to be a good citizen and also be part of an energy transition that doesn't happen in one day.
I think we have time for one more question, if there's still one in the audience.
Hi, my name is Sean. I'm a PhD student in the political science department here. And sorry to make this the last question, but I wanted to ask a question about Canada's other bilateral relationship, that is with Quebec. Kind of joking there. But so I lived in Quebec from 2014 to 2021, and the inward turn that Quebec has taken especially since COVID, is really striking. And I wanted to ask you if you think this is persistent. Is this the last gasp of the generation that brought the Quiet Revolution and then the independence referendums? Or is this going to be a kind of intergenerational thing even after the CAC government eventually changes hands? And is that sustainable? Are these decisions Quebec has made about stricter language laws, restrictions on migration, will they allow Quebec to develop economically in a way that allows them to have a living standard on par with the rest of Canada? And if there is an angle that's connected to what's happening with the states here, for example, do you view Quebec as kind of aligned with the rest of Canada in Canada's response? Then please feel free to add. Thank you.
So I don't know if I have a coherent, well thought out view on exactly where Quebec's going. I'll just say that. So, but I have a sense of a whole bunch of different dynamics that are going on at the same time. So right now, Quebecers are just as offended and upset with the Trump language as the rest of Canada. So that I know for sure. What's happening as a ramification of that is they are shifting their federal voting intentions from where they were parked, which was they were parked with the Bloc Québécois and the Conservatives, and they're shifting them over to the Liberals. So we're seeing that happen in real time. So that is actually one of the things that's making the upcoming federal election harder to predict. So that's happening. So there is a sense of allegiance with the Canadian cause that's happening. But there's a whole bunch of things underneath the surface that are happening at the same time. So the most talented politician in Quebec right now is the leader of the Parti Québécois in Quebec provincial politics. And that is interesting because sometimes individuals can make a difference. So he, I think, is the most likely next premier of Quebec, the Parti Québécois. We'll see. I mean, things can change and it's a volatile electorate. But if that's the case, they still have as part of their policy platform that they would like to hold a referendum. And there could be a moment in time where that's a possible outcome. And if that happened at the same time as either Mark Carney or Pierre Poilievre is prime minister, I want you to think about that because Mark Carney's French is not so terribly good. And Pierre Poilievre, he's kind of a nasty character that nobody in Quebec likes. So it's not a great scenario where you've got this charismatic Quebecois politician against someone that's not going to be totally endearing to the average Quebecer. So that's kind of a scenario that is out there. I think it's dislodged a little bit by this anti-Trump fervor that's going on right now. But there is a scenario where that anti-Trump fervor, for all of the fire and fury 6 months from now is dissipated and we're in a new scenario where it could be different. Now I say all that with another piece of information that I believe to be true, which is the next generation of Canadians, the generation that are Joy's age, I don't think they care as much about separatism as the generation before. So I don't know that it says resounding positive for that generation. But the next generation, the Joys of Quebec, they live in the urban centers and not in the rural centers. So there's a divide between urban and rural Quebec as well. So there's just a lot going on that I can't game it out. But it's volatile. It's volatile because the mix is volatile. So it would be not outside the realm of possibility that in 2 years we find ourselves with some sort of settled new normal with the United States, as bad as it could be, and a dissipation of the anger because you get used to anything, and then Quebec with a new talented leader that says, well, enough. Let's not be part of those guys anymore. So I wouldn't want to game it out because there's a lot more that can happen between now and then.
Hard to game out a political system with 5 parties that can get over 10% of the vote. First past the post. Can you all please join me in thanking the Honourable Bill Morneau for his time and discussion.